last and final prophet of Allah. He was a mercy unto the universe. Peace and blessings be on Al-Mustafa. So he began this perfect...
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Peace and the mercy of Allah be upon you. Welcome to the Hadith Principles. We're studying the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, the second important source of our Islamic teaching, and the principles used by scholars to examine and authenticate those Hadith. It's a pleasure to be with you, and also we have our brothers here who are with us in the studio or helping us, Brother Ayman and Brother Hussam and Brother Adil. Welcome, brothers, inshallah. I hope we're all benefiting from this. Inshallah, Allah will increase our knowledge and faith, inshallah, through study of the prophetic Hadith Principles, inshallah. We've been really learning about the different sources of the Hadith, the authors of famous Hadith books, and the scholars who, in every level, examined the Hadith and applied really very high critical standards so that they could authenticate Hadith. And so they could deliver to us the Hadith literature intact and protected in its meaning so that we would not be confused, inshallah, whether the Hadith are authentic or not, whether we can rely upon them in studying our religion. In every generation, Muslims from the time of the Sahaba, second generation, third generation, until today, every Muslim group and school of thought used and relied upon the Hadith of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon them, as evidence alongside the Quran about our Islamic doctrine and practices in all different areas. And it was at a very comparatively late date that some people started to question the whole reliability entirely of the corpus of Hadith, and that was a later innovation, and especially in modern times, in the time of the Orientalists in the past 200 years, the Orientalists and people who have followed after them, Muslim and non-Muslim, have questioned the reliability of the Hadith. And many times they have assumed that the Hadith were never even written down or recorded until Bukhari and Muslim in the 3rd century. And so for 200 plus years, there were no Hadith, and that was something that was sort of popped up out of nowhere, was invented at a later time. And they came up with many different theories about that, and those things have been categorically refuted. One of the scholars in modern time, Muhammad Mustafa al-Adami, originally from Pakistan, who is now in Saudi Arabia, in his doctoral work in London, did extensive research on the writing of the early Hadith and recording in the first generation, and proved categorically from the sources the writing of Hadith and the impossibility that Hadith were fabricated in the 3rd century. But in fact, the Hadiths were collected in the generation of the companions and the Tabi'in, the 2nd generation, as well as by the later scholars. But very often people are unaware of or have totally ignored that kind of research that you will find about the principles of Hadith and the history of the collection of the Hadith and the stages of which our scholars have examined the Hadith. Among the early scholars, when they applied all the critical examination to the isnad, the chain of narrators, and to the metin, the body of text of the Hadith, they would just say it's sahih or da'if, which means it's authentic or correct, and it's weak. In other words, it's unacceptable as a standard of evidence in Islamic studies or in determining what our religion is. And so they were very simple. Later scholars, beginning with Tirmidhi, also added a third category, which is al-Hasan. And Hasan is a hadith which is considered good. It is not on the level of the Sahih, is a little bit lower, but it is above the level of da'if. And so they formed more careful grades or classifications of the hadith. And you could call the Sahih hadith a grade A hadith, inshallah. In that case, maybe the mutawatir hadith would be the A+. And the Hasan hadith would then be a B hadith, inshallah. And then a da'if hadith, which is raised up to the level of Hasan, could be called maybe, say, a C level, a useful hadith, while a hadith that was da'if or weak would be a D level hadith. And in my opinion, for example, a hadith that's mawdu', total fabrication, would be an F hadith. It wouldn't be acceptable even to call that a hadith at all. But this terminology became specified by the later scholars of hadith and compiled in the many different books of the Hadith Principles that were written in the time of development after the golden age of Islamic hadith, when the hadith were all compiled in the major collections. Then the hadith scholars started examining the principles, the criteria used to prove hadiths and to select them and grade them. They started examining those in their literature of the mustalah of hadith, the books about the Islamic terminology of hadith or hadith principles that were written up until the completion of that study. In modern times, people largely write simply textbooks for students on the hadith, relying on the research of the past. They don't really invent new principles for analyzing the hadith, but they rely on their opinion of the best of what they have researched of the past, and Allah knows best. And so these classifications are very important. We hear them, but we may not always be familiar exactly with their knowledge. The Sahih hadith is the hadith which has a reporter. It has a continuous isnad, muttasal al-isnad, continuous all the way up, made up of reporters, the name of the people in each level of the isnad, who have trustworthy memory and convey it and remember the hadith and convey it to us, whether they're conveying it in a written form or orally. So they are dhabit. They have a dhabt. They have strong memories. And they're adil, that it means they are good Muslims of good repute, and they convey that in a continuous chain, muttasal, free of any of the defects that we talked about, like being shadh, being contradictory, or mudtarab, of the confusion and muddleness among those hadith, or the hidden defects like the ilal of the hadiths. And so the hadith such as that is called the Sahih. And that is the highest level in the grading of the hadith. The Sahih hadith is the one that is continuous. Each level they knew the other one. Each one is adil, trustworthy Muslim. Each one is known, strong memory, strong skills, accuracy in recording and relaying the information of the hadith. And after examining it, it appears, inshallah, to be free of any of those irregularities or defects. And so when you look at that, you see that a hadith such as that, any of the disqualifications could not be sahih. So we said munqati' hadith, where there's a break in the chain, they can't be sahih. They can't be an authentic hadith. Or the muttarab, maqlub, where things are backwards in the hadith, they're not authentic, even though the chain does appear. The shadh that contradicts other more reliable sources, and the hidden tadlis, where some of the sheikhs or teachers are, the true sheikh or teacher or source of this hadith is being disguised, as well as the hidden defects or ilal of the hadith. Of all of the collectors of hadith, Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim are considered to be of the highest level. And they were greatly admired because they really worked very, very hard to collect sahih hadith only, and not to put hadiths which they had any doubt at all. And so it is considered that they are the best, but even the hadiths in those books, the ones that they agree upon, are even considered the best of the best. And among them, certain ones. So, for example, people talk about Al-Bukhari narrates all of the hadiths from Imam Malik, from the Muwatta. All of the hadiths of the Prophet, that go all the way to the Prophet, are narrated by Al-Bukhari. But of that, when he narrates from Malik, from Nafi', from Abdullah ibn Umar to the Prophet ﷺ, that's considered the golden sanad. It's the golden chain. And that is because Imam Malik spent his life in Medina. His teacher was Nafi'. And Nafi' was the Mawla of Abdullah ibn Umar. That is, he was captive and he became a Muslim and was freed at the hands of Abdullah ibn Umar. And Abdullah ibn Umar was his teacher, and he learned hadith from Abdullah ibn Umar. And so it's only Malik, Nafi', and this Sahabi. And so it's one of the great chains, and there are others, of course, that are found in other books. And so people consider that. They consider Bukhari is at the highest and Muslim is secondary, but sometimes they prefer some of the narrations of Muslim, and scholars sometimes prefer Bukhari. But in general, those that are narrated by both of them are at the highest level possible. And those that are on the level of Bukhari, Muslim, but are left out. So for example, Al-Hakim narrates in the Mustadrak many hadith he claims are on the level of Bukhari or Muslim or both. And so those are considered very high when they are on that level, even though they're not in those books. And beneath them are books that are authentic but are less than that. We're going to go for a break, and inshallah we'll be back shortly. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah.
You have questions that bother you. What about issues of concern to you? Would you like to share things on your mind with us? Are you interested in solutions based on an Islamic perspective? Please join me live in Meet Your Advisor every Friday at 9 p.m. Mecca time, here on Huda TV.
Dear viewers, Huda programs can be watched in the English section of the in-flight entertainment directory on board all Saudi airline flights, domestic and international. Sit back, relax, and enjoy watching Huda's entertaining and enlightening shows on your trip. Huda wishes you a safe and successful journey. Huda, a light in every home.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Hadith Principles. Before the break, we're talking about the Sahih Hadiths, the Hadiths that are considered to be authentic Hadiths. That means they are a source for Muslims in understanding our deen, our religion, whether Aqeedah, our doctrines and beliefs, or the fiqh, our practices, or the practical application of Islam. And so the highest level in the hadith is considered sahih. Sahih means right, or it's whole or healthy. And so it is an authentic hadith, inshallah, an authentic source for Muslims to understand their religion. I call this, and it's only my thing, it's not official, but I call it a grade A hadith. Because in my country and a lot of other places, when you get an A, that's the best. And so it's the best hadith. There may be hadiths that are A+. So the mutawatir hadiths are sahih, but they're sahih hadiths that are backed up by so many different narrators in every level that they are undoubtedly, indisputably authentic, and so they are really, really great. But most of the hadith sahih, they're only narrated by a few sahabi, one or two, and so they're called ahad hadith, and they're still authentic and they're still good, but they're an a hadith. And so the early scholars called any hadith that was basically in any level of authenticity, they called it sahih, and any hadith that was less than that, they called it da'if, or weak. But the later scholars developed a more careful terminology, so they have sahih, hasan lidatihi, and we'll talk about that more in other episodes, inshallah. Now, you guys remind me, what are the criteria for the sahih hadith, inshallah? What's the first one? Anybody remember?
متصل.
It's muttasal. And what's that mean?
Continuous.
Continuous. Every level of the isnad, each from the narrator to the Prophet, is continuous.
Or of a consecutive testimony.
Yes. And what's the next?
Mursal.
No. What's the next criteria for a sahih hadith?
It should be transmitted via credible narrators.
Yes. The narrators, it has to be continuous. Each narrator met the other narrator, and those narrators themselves must be
Credible.
Good, credible Muslims.
Yes,
They're
Muslims
thiqah, trustworthy, adil,
accurate,
honest, and they have accuracy. Ad-dhabt. They're dhabit. Dhabt means they have learned the hadith in an accurate way, in memory and writing, and have conveyed it in an accurate way without mistakes. What else?
and the trustworthy as well as for the narrators.
And he's doing it from somebody like him. What else did you say?
Trustworthy as for narrators.
Yes, trustworthy. Trustworthy, that is the adala and thiqah. Thiqah means the trustworthy in hadith, and adala means as a good Muslim in general, even if he's not in hadith.
And sound mind.
Yes, not forgetful, not senile. That would affect his accuracy. So sometimes somebody in their youth were accurate, and later on they were not accurate. And so then you have to look to the students. When did they learn from him? Did they learn from him when he was accurate or in later times? What else? So it's continuous chain, and each level of the chain we have accuracy and trustworthiness.
It should be free from any hidden defect.
Free from the hidden defects and discrepancies. The hidden defects, like the illal that are hard to find, the illa, hidden defects, it appears sound but it doesn't. The contradiction, the shadh, it's not shadh, it doesn't contradict a stronger source.
And not mudallas.
It doesn't have tadlis.
No more idraj.
Or idraj, words of another. And there are many. We will never have time to discuss all of them. There's many very delicate areas and principles that the scholars use. And so it can have tadlis where it appears that it's continuous, but in fact there's a break there, or the shaykh is not really mentioned, or words other than the words of the Prophet ﷺ are introduced into the hadith, either its isnad or its text, inshallah. So that is the authentic hadith. And so in Islam, when we say a hadith is sahih, that is a big statement.
Yes.
Because that's your deen, that's your religion. And so if we take our religion from the wrong source, we could be led astray. Yes. Subhanallah.
Excuse me, sir, I have a
Yes,
question, please.
yes.
And at the beginning of this episode, your honor said that the Sunnah is the second source of Islamic law.
Yes.
So what is the significance of the fact that the Sunnah is the second source, and are there any other sources of Islamic law?
Yes. There are, and in fact, the Quran is the first source. And we say it's the first, not because we are disparaging the Sunnah, but because Allah revealed the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad in word, and every single word is preserved and is miraculously inimitable. Allah challenged people to produce like unto it, and they cannot do it. So the word of Allah cannot be compared to anything else. But the Sunnah is necessary along with the Quran. It's not secondary, that first you look in the hadith, the Quran, as some people think. And then if you don't find any verse in the Quran, then you look in the hadith. That's oversimplified. So that's what people think as first and second. But you need both at the same time. because the Prophet ﷺ, he lived the Qur'an, as Aisha radiallahu anha said about him, كَانَ خُلُقُهُ الْقُرْآنِ, that his whole way of life, his behavior was the Qur'an in real life. So he showed us in his example, in his words and deeds, what the Qur'an meant. And so we need both of them together. Each one enhances the other one. Each one depends upon the other. Allah didn't send the Qur'an without and except through the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him. So we need both of them together, inshallah.
Some scholars say about hadith, athar, and some others say khabar. So what's the difference between
these? These are different terms, and people who are not Arabic speaking probably don't know about them. Athar mean literally the traces or the footsteps. And so the athar of the Prophet is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. But sometimes athar are used also referring to other than the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And even sunnah is used that way, but more often sunnah is talking about the Prophet ﷺ. And khabar means a report. It means exactly the same thing as a hadith, but some people distinguish and they say about the Prophet hadith, and the saying of sahabi, they say about it khabar. And those are particular uses used by different people. But in fact, very often they're all the same thing. The khabar and the hadith and the athar are the same thing. So we say tafsir bil ma'thur. That means the tafsir, interpretation of the Qur'an, that by athar. And athar, in that case, it means hadith of the Prophet, as well as sayings of the companions and other second generation scholars of tafsir. That is the athar. And so the athar are maybe from the Salaf or the first 3 generations saying, or it could be just the Prophet. And khabar is the same. Khabar is the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, but sometimes it could be khabar of someone else also. So all of them are interchangeable, inshallah.
Yes, I have a question, please.
Yes.
Yes, there are some hadiths where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking. What are those hadiths called?
Mashallah. The hadith Qudsi is a special kind of hadith. That is where the Prophet says, Allah Almighty says.
Yes.
And it's not something from the Qur'an. It's in the words of the Prophet, relaying the meaning from Allah Almighty. And so it's a meaning known to the Prophet by inspiration from Allah, but perhaps in the words of the Prophet himself, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. The difference is, of course, hadith Qudsi could be sahih, or it could be da'if, could be mawdu'. Some people think because it's hadith Qudsi, it could not be da'if. And that's not true. Just like anybody could fabricate from the Prophet a saying, they could fabricate a hadith Qudsi also. But the hadith Qudsi cannot be recited in prayers. It's not protected by Allah in word. And so it's not, there's no challenge to mankind to produce like unto it. But it is a meaning which is authentic, conveyed by the Prophet from Allah Almighty, inshallah.
We have time for another.
Maybe one more.
Okay, this is Sahaba used to narrate the hadith in its wording, the same wording as the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu
The
alaihi wasallam.
Sahaba narrated the hadith both in wording and sometimes in meaning. And so many hadiths, they demonstrate what the Prophet said. And sometimes they say, I think he said this. Or they say, or he said this, or he said that. Because they had maybe a doubt about the exact wording. And so it's clear sometimes they narrated the hadith in exact words and sometimes in meaning. So sometimes we see 2 authentic versions of the same hadith, but there's a slight difference. The same meaning, but slight difference in the wording, and both of them are authentic. And so we know that they narrated them in both ways. Inshallah, Allah will forgive us our sins and make our efforts on behalf of Islam to be for our benefit in this world and on the Day of Judgment. May Allah Almighty bless all of you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah. He was a mercy unto the universe. Peace and blessings be on Al-Mustafa. So he began this perfect man, sending his word across the land, leading only by his sunnah. In the Quran, the word of Allah, he brought the answer to this cruel world. Our beloved Prophet Muhammad.